Reading through the Bible in one year, January 24th, Genesis 25, Matthew 24, Esther chapter 1, and Acts chapter 24. Abraham had taken another wife. Remember, the guy was like 137 when his wife died. And she bore him Zimran, Jokshan, Medan, Midian, Ishbak, and Shua. Jokshan fathered Sheba and Dedan. Dedan's sons were the Asherim, Letushim, and Lemuimim. And Midian's sons were Ephah, Hanok, Abida, Eldah. These were the sons of Keturah. Abraham gave everything he owned to Isaac. Remember, that was important. That's the child of promise. But Abraham gave gifts to the sons of his concubines while he was still alive, and sent them eastward, away from his son Isaac to the land of the east. This is the length of Abraham's years, 175 years. He took his last breath and died at what anybody would call a good old age, old and contented, and he was gathered to his people. His sons, Isaac and Ishmael, buried him in the cave of Machpelah, the same place he buried his wife, near Mamre, in the field of Ephron, son of Zohar the Hethite. This was the field that Abraham bought from the Hethites. Abraham was buried there with his wife Sarah. After Abraham's death, God blessed his son Isaac, who lived in Beer Lahai Roi. These are the records of Abraham's son, Ishmael, whom Hagar the Egyptian, Sarah's slave, bore to Abraham. Cool. Making sure we don't lose any notes here. These are the names of Ishmael's sons. Their names, according to the family records, are Nebaioth, Ishmael's firstborn, then Kedar, Adbeel, Mibsam, Mishma, Duma, Massa, Hadad, Tema, Jetur, Naphish, and Kedemah. These are Ishmael's sons, and these are their names by their settlements and encampments, 12 leaders of their 12 clans. This is the length of Ishmael's life, 137 years. He took his last breath and died, and was gathered to his people. And they settled from Havilah to Shur, which is opposite Egypt as you go toward Ashur. He stayed near all his relatives. These are the family records of Isaac, son of Abraham. Abraham fathered Isaac. Isaac was 40 years old when he took his wife Rebekah, daughter of Bethuel the Aramean from Paddan Aram, the sister of Laban the Aramean. Again, that's important. It comes up later. Isaac prayed to the Lord on behalf of his wife because she was childless. And the Lord was receptive to his prayer, and his wife Rebekah conceived. But the children inside her, the twins, struggled with each other. And she said, "Why is this happening to me?" So she went to inquire of the Lord. And the Lord told her, "2 nations are in your womb. 2 peoples will come from you and be separated. The older will serve the younger." When her time came to give birth, there were indeed twins in her womb. The first one came out red-looking, covered with hair like a fur coat, and they named him Esau, which means red. It doesn't show it. After this, his brother came out, grasping Esau's heel with the hand, so he was named Jacob, which means trickster, or grasps the heel, right? Isaac was 60 years old when they were born. When the boys grew up, Esau became an expert hunter and an outdoorsman, but Jacob was a quiet man who stayed at home. Isaac loved Esau because he had taste for wild game, but Rebekah loved Jacob because, again, she was the one who knew that he would be the one to rule. Once, when Jacob was cooking a stew, Esau came in from the field exhausted, and he said to Jacob, "Let me eat some of that red stuff, because I'm exhausted." It's a red lentil stew. That is why he was also named Edom, which means red. Told you. Okay. Jacob replied, "First, sell me your birthright." That's a ridiculous price. But "Look," said Esau, "I'm about to die, so what good is a birthright to me?" Jacob said, "Swear to me first." So he swore to Jacob and sold his birthright to him. Then Jacob gave bread and lentil stew to Esau. He ate, drank, and got up and went away. So Esau despised his birthright. Now, we can't really say that he despised it because later on he lamented the fact that he gave it up. And remember, the birthright, that is the promise that you are to inherit everything from the father, right? That's typically how it worked. And for most other nations, that's how it would go. If you were in any other family in that time, if you were the firstborn son, you would inherit everything from your father, or at least the lion's share of what it is. And then your lesser brothers going not genetically, but going generally by age, they would receive less and less as it went further down. But here, this is showing God's choice for who he wants to elect for the children. The first child of Abraham was Ishmael, but God chose Isaac. And here the firstborn child was Edom, right? Well, Esau. But it is Jacob whom he has chosen. See how this works? It's following after God's choice for who it's going to be, not by man's standard. And this will continue on throughout the rest of the book, not just Genesis, the rest of the Bible. All right. Because again, God is sovereign over his entire creation. That's important. All right, let's move on to Matthew chapter 24. Now, there's really two general texts that are referred to when people talk about the things to come when it comes to the Gospels, where we're asked specifically about how the things are going to be in the end times, at least in the Gospel accounts. And one of those is here in Matthew 24. Now, as we go through these things, you'll notice that his disciples ask two questions, and he answers both of them separately. We'll get into that in a minute. Verse 1. As Jesus left and was going out of the temple, his disciples came up and called his attention to the buildings and how beautiful they were. And he replied to them, "Do you see all of these things? Truly, I tell you, not one stone will be left here upon another that will not be thrown down." And again, that's true. If you go to Jerusalem today, you can find at the Wailing Wall these giant stones that were thrown off the Temple Mount itself and thrown to the ground in 70 AD when the temple was utterly destroyed. Those massive stones are still there, and you can find pictures of them or go and look at them yourself. And while he was sitting on the Mount of Olives, his disciples approached him privately and said, "Tell us, when will these things happen?" First question. "And what is the sign of your coming and of the end of the age?" That's really three questions, but it's two separate things. First, when will these things happen? Second, what is the sign? And what are the signs of the end of the age? So that's what they're asking. So Jesus replied to them, "Watch out that no one deceives you. For many will come in my name, saying, 'I am the Messiah.'" We still have people doing that today. "And they will deceive many. You are going to hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not alarmed, because these things must first take place, but the end is not yet. For nation will rise up against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and there will be famines and earthquakes in various places. All these are but the beginning of the labor pains." And if you think about how labor pains come, typically you have one labor pain, and then there's a period of time. And then another one comes, and they increase in frequency, and they also increase in, I almost use the term violence, but that's not the right word. They increase in amplitude, right? They keep getting bigger or larger, whatever they happen to be. So these are typically how that works out. So just a quick note so you know that. All right. Then They will hand you over to be persecuted. So he's answering now another question. They will hand you over to be persecuted, and they will kill you. People talk about the health and wealth prosperity gospel. This is the prosperity. This is the future that existed for his disciples. Death. And not just death, like that you die of old age, but typically a painful, torturous death. You will be hated by all nations because of my name, because they're related to him. And many will fall away and betray one another and hate one another. Many false prophets will rise up and deceive many, because lawlessness will multiply. The love of many will grow cold. But the one who endures to the end will be saved. This good news of the kingdom will be proclaimed in all the world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. So, when you see the abomination of desolation, spoken of by the prophet Daniel, standing in the holy place, let the reader understand. Then those in Judea must flee to the mountains. A man on the housetop must not come down to get his things out of the house, and a man in the field must not go back to get his coat. Woe to pregnant women and nursing mothers in those days. Pray that your escape may not be in winter or on a Sabbath, for at that time there will be great distress, and the kind that hasn't taken place from the beginning of the world until now, and never again. Unless those days were cut short, no one would be saved. But those days will be cut short because of the elect. Again, the elect being God's chosen people. If anyone tells you, here is the Messiah, or over here, don't believe it. For false messiahs and false prophets will arise and perform great signs and wonders to lead astray, if possible, even though it's not possible, even the elect. Take note that I have told you in advance. So if they tell you he is in the wilderness, don't go out. Or see, he's in the storerooms, don't believe it. For as the lightning comes from the east and flashes as far as the west, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. Wherever the carcass is, there the vultures will gather. I can read the note on that part because it gets a little confusing, but the main point to think about here is the fact that he's telling them that when he returns, you're not going to miss it. It's not going to be something that happens quietly in some far-flung area of Judah. Another line here on where the corpse is. The proverb may reinforce the announcement that Jesus' second coming will be a public and unmistakable, will be public and unmistakable, or since the word vultures can also refer to eagles, which also eat carrion, an emblem of the Roman Empire, it may mean the convergence of Roman troops on Jerusalem, and its temple will signal the death of a covenant people who have refused their Messiah, and the transfer of God's kingdom to a new international Israel. Romans chapter 9 explains this, that fulfills all the old covenant people, or all that the old covenant people were supposed to be. Picking back up in verse 29 here. Immediately after the distress of those days, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not shed its light. These stars, plural, will fall from the sky, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. Now, this is talking about the coming of the Son of Man. This is when Jesus returns in power and authority. Then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in the sky. Then all the peoples of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. He will send out his angels with a loud trumpet, and they will gather his elect from the four winds, from one end of the sky to the other. Learn this lesson from the fig tree. Remember, we talked about that a couple days ago. As soon as its branch becomes tender and sprouts leaves, you know that summer is near. In the same way, when you see all these things, recognize that he is near, at the door. Truly, I tell you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will never pass away. I'm going to read the note on the this generation part because that gets very confusing. I'm going to read the long note out of the ESV Study Bible because the Reformation Study Bible is very short in this note. This is an important one. Quote, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. Several interpretations have been offered for this difficult passage. First, some think, quote, this generation, unquote, refers to the disciples who were alive when Jesus was speaking, and that, quote, all these things, unquote, refers to the beginning, but not the completion, of the sufferings described in verses 4 through 25. Second, others see in, quote, all these things, unquote, a prediction with multiple fulfillments, so that Jesus's disciples will be both, quote, this generation, unquote, that sees the destruction of the temple in 70 AD, and also those at the end of the age who see the events surrounding the, quote, abomination of desolation, unquote, that we read in verse 15. The third option, since, quote, this generation of, unquote, in the Old Testament can mean a people who have a certain quality. We've seen this in Psalm 14:5 and 24:6. Others understand, quote, this generation, unquote, to refer to either A, this generation of believers throughout the entire present age, or B, to this evil generation, unquote, that will remain until Christ. I just lost my spot. There we go. That will remain until Christ returns to establish his kingdom. The fourth option, others, particularly some dispensational interpreters, understand, quote, generation, unquote, to mean race. This is another sense of the Greek term genea, and I think it refers to the Jewish people who will not pass away until Jesus returns. The fifth option is that others understand, quote, this generation, unquote, to mean the generation that sees, quote, all these things, unquote. Namely, the generation alive when the final period of great tribulation begins. According to this view, the illustration of the fig tree, verse 32, shows that when the final events begin, Christ will come soon. Just as, quote, all these things, unquote, in verse 33 refers to events leading up to, but not including Christ's return. So, in verse 34, quote, all these things, unquote, refers to the same events. That is, the events described in verses 4 through 25. Again, this is why I like reading the notes from the ESV Study Bible, because they show all of the possible ranges of what it could be, and you can make your own interpretation based on that text. That said, nobody really knows what it's going to be. You can interpret it however you want, but as with all things in the eschaton, that is the last things, right? Jesus doesn't tell us to be experts in the things that are sort of revealed to us. As we later read the rest of the apocalyptic books and the things that talk about the last things, you'll find that it's a lot of things in types and shadows and nothing in really, firmly defined lines. We're not to know those things perfectly. We're to see little signs, which he's already shown us a lot of those, and to recognize when those things start taking place. It'll make sense to us at that time. But up to that point, we're not supposed to know it clearly. Instead, we are to, as Jesus has already mentioned, be found doing the work of God when he comes back. Not work to save ourselves, but the work of God in spreading the gospel, taking care of those within our circle of influence, those in church and those in the world as well. Those are the things we're to be found doing when Jesus arrives, not simply focusing on ourselves and living lives of sin. All right, let's pick back up in verse 36 here. Now, concerning that day and hour, Nobody knows. Neither the angels in heaven nor the Son. Jesus himself doesn't know, except the Father alone. As the days of Noah were, so will the coming of the Son of Man be. For in those days before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, until the day Noah boarded the ark. They didn't know until the flood came and swept them all away. This is the way the coming of the Son of Man will be. 2 men will be grinding in the field, and one will be taken and one left. 2 women will be grinding grain with a hand mill, and one will be taken and another left. Therefore, be alert, since you don't know what day your Lord is coming. But know this, if the homeowner had known what time the thief was coming, well, he would have stayed alert and would not have let his house be broken into. This is why you are also to be ready, because the Son of Man is coming at an hour you do not expect. I've often thought about this, and the fact that when Jesus returns, right, the rest of the world is going to be going about its business. It's not even going to know. It's not even going to recognize it when he comes. So this is why we must always be ready. Now, I know they've been saying this for 2,000 years, which, I mean, I could lead on and say, well, that means it's soon. Well, we don't know. Maybe Jesus is planning to come back in the year 5022. We don't know. It's up to God the Father to make that decision. So we are always to be doing the work of God. And that's it. And if Jesus decides to come back in this moment, or this week, or next year, or next 1,000 years, we're always to be found doing the work of God in that time leading up to it. Always being ready. Verse 45. So, who then is a faithful and wise servant, whom his master has put in charge of his household to give them food at the proper time? Blessed is that servant whom the master finds so doing his job when he comes. Truly, I tell you, he will put him in charge of all his possessions. But if that wicked servant says in his heart, my master's delayed, and starts to beat his fellow servants and eats and drinks with drunkards, that servant's master will come on a day he does not expect him, and at an hour he does not know. And he will cut him to pieces and assign him a place with the hypocrites, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. It's kind of weird to me how how in this one section, I mean, he's been pretty good so far with his analogies, right? And the parables. This one completely breaks down as he starts telling it. Because if it's just a regular servant he's talking about, who the master comes and finds not doing his work, he's typically not going to cut him in pieces and send him away with the hypocrites, right? So this one breaks down, but that's okay. All right, so let's move on to Esther chapter 1. And as we're in a new book, let's go ahead and read that introduction, if I can get there. There we go. All right. So the book of Esther never mentions God's name. Neat little thing with this one. Yet God clearly orchestrated all of its events. Again, showing the sovereignty of God over his creation. And even over nations where he is not really respected or acknowledged. Esther, a Jew living among the exiles in Persia, became queen of the empire about 480 BC. Haman, a Persian official, sought to eradicate the Jewish minority, but God had prepared Esther, quote, for such a time as this, unquote, which we'll see in chapter 4, verse 14, to save his covenant people. The book was written some decades later to document the origins of the Jewish observance of Purim, which celebrates Israel's survival and God's faithfulness. The author is unknown, but some believe that it could have been Esther's cousin Mordecai, who is a key person in the book. Throughout the book, we see God's sovereign hand preserving his people, showing that everything is under his control. Also, as a quick note here, I wonder if this is the same Mordecai who we read about in the last book, who was one of the people who went back to Jerusalem. All right, let's go ahead and move. Verse 1. These events took place during the days or the reign of Ahasuerus, who ruled 127 provinces from India to Cush. In those days, King Ahasuerus reigned from his royal throne in the fortress at Susa. He held a feast in the 3rd year of his reign for all his officials and staff, the army of Persia and Media, the nobles, and the officials from the provinces, all 127. He displayed the glorious wealth of his kingdom and the magnificent splendor of his greatness for a total of 180 days. This is a 6-month party. At the end of this time, the king held a week-long banquet in the garden courtyard of the royal palace for all the people, from the greatest to the least, who were present in the fortress of Susa. White and blue linen hangings were fastened with fine white and purple linen cords to silver rods on marble columns. Gold and silver couches were arranged on a mosaic pavement of red feldspar, marble, mother of pearl, and precious stones. Drinks were served in an array of gold goblets, each with a different design. Royal wine flowed freely according to the king's bounty, and the drinking was according to the royal decree. There are no restrictions. It was an open bar. The king had ordered every wine steward in his household to serve whatever each person wanted. Queen Vashti, his wife, also gave a feast for the women of King Ahasuerus' palace. On the 7th day, when the king was feeling good from the wine, Ahasuerus commanded Mehuman, Biztha, Harbona, Bigtha, Abagatha, that one's a hard one to say, Zethar and Carcass, the 7 eunuchs who personally served him, to bring Queen Vashti before him with her royal crown. He wanted to show off her beauty to the people and the officials, because she was very beautiful. But Queen Vashti refused to come at the king's command that was delivered by his eunuchs. And the king became furious, and his anger burned within him. The king consulted the wise men who understood the times, for it was his normal procedure to confer with experts in law and justice. The most trusted ones were Karshena, Shethar, Admatha, Tarshish, Meres, Marsena, and Memucan. They were the 7 officials of Persia and Media who had personal access to the king and occupied the highest positions in the kingdom. The king asked, according to the law, what should be done with Queen Vashti, since she refused to obey King Ahasuerus' command that was delivered by the eunuchs. Memucan said in the presence of the king and his officials, Queen Vashti has wronged not only the king, but all the officials and the people who are in every one of King Ahasuerus' provinces. For the queen's actions will become public knowledge to all the women and cause them to despise their husbands and say, well, King Ahasuerus ordered Queen Vashti brought before him, but she did not come. Before this day is over, the noble women of Persia and Media who hear about this queen's act will say the same thing to all the king's officials, resulting in more contempt and fury. If it meets the king's approval, he should personally issue a royal decree. Let it be recorded in the laws of the Persians and the Medes so that it cannot be revoked. Vashti is not to enter King Ahasuerus' presence, and her royal position is to be given to another woman who is more worthy than she. The decree the king issues will be heard throughout his vast kingdom, so all women will honor their husbands from the least from the greatest to the least. The king and his counselors approved the proposal, and yep, that's all the notes. They approved the proposal, and he followed Memucan's advice. He sent letters to all the royal provinces, to each province in its own script, and to each ethnic group in its own language, that every man should be master of his house, or a master of his own house, and speak in the language of his own people. All right, let's move on to Acts chapter 24. "5 days later, Ananias the high priest came down with some elders and a lawyer named Tertullus, and the men presented their case against Paul to the governor. Remember, Paul had been arrested. He had been brought into the barracks in Jerusalem. And Paul had made his defense to the Sanhedrin, the ruling party, not the ruling party. It's kind of like the Congress of Jews in Jerusalem. They rule over all of the religious matters for Judaism within Jerusalem. And he made his defense there, and then they had a small riot, so they pulled him away. And there were some guys who promised never to eat again until they had killed him. So they were going to ask to have him come to them, so that they could quote, examine his case more carefully, unquote. But they were going to ambush him on the way and kill him. 40 guys were planning to do this. Well, this was revealed to the commander in Jerusalem. And he sent Paul away to Felix, the governor of Judea. And so now he's there. Paul is there, right? He was sent off with 200 soldiers and 70 spearmen who took him most of the way. And then the rest of the soldiers took him the rest of the way down to where he needed to go. And now he's waiting in Herod's Praetorium, basically Herod's palace. That's where he's being held now. Until Felix can decide his case. So that's what was happening. And they were waiting for the people to come down. So 5 days later, the people came down. And when Paul was called in, Tertullus, the lawyer, again, when we read the term lawyer, we don't think of lawyer like we know him. He's an expert in the law, hence why he's called a lawyer. So these men presented their case against Paul to the governor, and then Paul was brought in. Because again, under Roman law, you have the right to meet with your accuser, to face them. So, and this is especially true for Paul, who is a Roman citizen, a born Roman citizen. So once Paul was brought in, Tertullus began to accuse him and said, "Oh, most excellent Felix." We're going to get to that later, but it's hilarious. "We enjoy great peace because of you, and reforms are taking place for the benefit of this nation because of your foresight. We acknowledge this in every way and everywhere, most excellent Felix, with utmost gratitude. But so that I will not burn you any further, I request that you would be kind enough to give us just a brief hearing. For we have heard that this man is a plague, an agitator among all the Jews throughout the Roman world, and a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes. He even tried to desecrate the temple, and so we apprehended him. By examining him yourself, you'll be able to determine or discern the truth about these charges we are bringing against him." And the Jews also joined in the attack, alleging that all these things were true. Well, when the governor motioned for him to speak, Paul replied, "Because I know that you have been a judge of this nation for many years, I am glad to offer my defense in what concerns me. And you can verify for yourself, it is no more than 12 days since I went up to worship in Jerusalem. They didn't find me arguing with anyone or causing a disturbance among the crowd, either in the temple or in the synagogues or anywhere in the city. Neither can they prove the charges they are now making against me. But this I admit to you. I worship the God of my ancestors according to the way," again, the way meaning Christian faith, "which they call a sect, believing everything that is in accordance with the law and written in the prophets. Why? Because all of them testify to Jesus as the Christ. I have a hope in God, which these men also themselves accept, that there will be a resurrection of both the unrighteous and the righteous. And I always strive to have a clear conscience toward God and men. After many years, I came to bring charitable gifts and offering to my people. And while I was doing this, some Jews from Asia found me ritually purified in the temple, without a crowd and without any uproar. It is they who ought to be here before you to bring charges, if they have anything against me. Or let these men here state what wrongdoing they found in me when I stood before the Sanhedrin. Other than this one statement I shouted while standing among them, "Today I am on trial before you concerning the resurrection of the dead," which wasn't entirely true, but he knew that they were just going to keep bickering and fighting over him. So he, he applied himself to one of the groups. There's two different main groups of the Jews. There's the Sadducees, who don't believe in resurrection or angels or anything, and then there's the Pharisees, who believe in them all. So he said, I believe in the resurrection, and there's a big battle between them and whatever. Anyway, so he's admitting that, yeah, I yelled that one thing, which I probably shouldn't have. Verse 22. Since Felix was well informed about the way, Christianity, he adjourned the hearing, saying, when Lysias the commander comes down, I will decide your case. He ordered that the centurion keep Paul under guard, but that he should also have some freedom, and that he should not prevent any of his friends from meeting his needs. That may sound weird, but that was a normal thing to happen. If you were in prison, what would happen is your family or your friends would take care of your needs. They would bring you, you would have the ability to typically send letters. You could write and do things. They could bring you food, because the food that they gave you was typically meager rations. But your friends and family could bring you food. They could bring you clothing. They could bring you other things. So that's typically how that worked. Normally, you wouldn't get any of those things, because it was assumed your family would do that for you. Several days later, when Felix came with his wife Drusilla, who was Jewish, he sent for Paul and listened to him on the subject of faith in Christ Jesus. Now, as he spoke about righteousness, self-control, and the judgment to come, Felix became afraid and replied, leave for now, but when I have an opportunity, I'll call for you. If you've ever shared your faith with somebody, you've likely seen something similar. At the same time, he was also hoping that Paul would offer him money, so he sent for him quite often and conversed with him. After 2 full years had passed, I lost my spot. There we go. Porcius Festus succeeded Felix, and because Felix wanted to do the Jews a favor, he left Paul in the prison. All right, and that is all the notes for now. God willing, we'll be back tomorrow. Behold, the word of the Lord.